Since the controversy for the so-called child separation policy for those illegally crossing the border erupted last month, there have been protests in cities across the country. Demonstrations against immigration and customs enforcement, or ICE, coast to coast from New York City to Seattle, Chicago and Denver in between. I haven't seen a lot of actual violence or destruction happening, though there were 30 arrests in Philadelphia when protesters tried to block ICE vehicles from entering an ICE facility. And of course that crazy lady climbed the Statue of Liberty on the 4th of July to persuade everyone to her cause by ruining their vacations, causing some 4,000 people to be evacuated from the monument.
We didn't even spend more than 10 minutes there. It was just nothing.
I think there's a right way of protesting, a legal way of protesting, and she just ruined our whole trip.
There have been these isolated cases of crazy at these protests, but they're overall tamer than I would have predicted. They're crazy in message, sure, but not as crazy in tactics as I would expect, until I saw the true gold medal performance in the Crazy Olympics from the city of Portland, Oregon. What's happening there pushes the limits of just how crazy some of the politics of the left have become, but also just how far we are willing to go to enable these activists to do real damage to our communities. This particular episode of insanity has been ongoing for weeks, but hit a flashpoint on July 11th when Occupy ICE PDX protesters were arrested after blocking the driveway into an ICE facility in southwest Portland. Footage of the incident made the rounds on social media. After warning the protesters several times that they needed to move, police used pepper balls and tasers to push them back. In the end, there were 8 arrests. But to get the full effect of just how awful these Occupy ICE protesters were that day, you need to go to their own Periscope stream to see the full confrontation with the police. They predictably called the police KKK and Nazis and fascists, all the things you'd expect.
KKK.
You goddamn fascist!
Well, except for one problem, there was, in fact, racial and gender diversity in the police force. Yeah, but those guys are race traitors, the protesters said.
Fucking race traitor piece of shit! You're fucking nigger to the white man!
Yeah, you're a Latino descent, aren't you, you pot smoker? You fucking blood traitor!
At one point, one of the protesters even spits on a black officer, though it's unclear if it was accidental. More ironic still, these protesters heckled the police about their treatment of women.
That's how you fucking treat women!
Right before calling a female cop a fascist and a bitch.
Fuck you, you're fucking fascist!
I'm scared of you, bitch!
They also celebrated the prospective deaths of the officers.
Everyone hates you! I hope your whole fucking family hates you! I hope you die alone, cold and scared!
And lastly, there was this bizarre taunt. I gotta give credit to these cops for their general restraint. They only used force to move these protesters away from the driveway, and they only used force after warning the protesters several times. And as far as I can tell, they never used physical force in response to simple verbal provocation, no matter how racist or sexist or biologically challenged the taunting was throughout. But you know, maybe they actually weren't heavy-handed enough because the degeneracy has festered. For 6 weeks now, Occupy ICE PDX members have set up a permanent encampment outside the ICE facility, repurposing their presumed homelessness to new depths of uselessness. As of this week, the city is finally evicting the camp, but not before these protesters created a disgusting biohazard they've occupied for weeks as their natural habitat. And what's happened in the meantime isn't just a diseased, infectious mess for the city to clean up, it's real damage to charity in the city. Damage to a family who is doing real good for people who really need it. You see this little wooden cart building back here just behind the cops? That's a place called the Happy Camper Food and Coffee Bar, owned and operated by Scott and Julie Hakes. Their 21-year-old daughter works the stand, and all the profits generated go to support their charitable organization called Off the Grid, which serves the Portland homeless homeless community.
It's our passion due to the fact that Julie and I were both homeless in our past.
At some point during this ongoing encampment, Scott and Julie's daughter was laughing while serving a customer across the street from the Occupy ICE protesters, and the protesters became convinced that she was laughing at them. The protesters then targeted the Happy Camper stand with threats and harassment. There is footage of this that the Hakes family gave to local news. I haven't been able to find the original unedited footage, but the local news coverage gives you some idea of what happened.
Hake says it all started when one of them began yelling at his daughter who was working the cart.
Do you hear him? They think I'm laughing at them.
They start screaming that my daughter is laughing at them, trying to make a mockery of them, everything that they believe in, and boom, away it went. We were on the #1 hit list from that point on.
He says they've threatened her too.
If they catch her outside the cart, they're gonna hurt her.
Which is awesome, isn't it?
Yeah.
You're lucky you're a white girl.
We're a business. Leave us out.
You know what? I'm not gonna let anybody treat my family like that.
Reportedly, tensions further escalated when Scott's daughter had the audacity to serve food to a Homeland Security officer, resulting in death threats and intimidation of other customers. Scott says in recent weeks, the food cart has taken an 80% business hit. And here's where we reach the real bummer: the consequences of enabling this degeneracy, as Portland Mayor Ted Wheeler has. For weeks, the mayor instructed Portland police not to intervene in the camp at all, and when it finally became so literally toxic he had to give the camp the boot, he still said he agrees with Occupy ICE's message and thanked them for bringing attention to the issue.
I stand with those who are opposed to the forced separation of children from their parents, families, in many cases who are fleeing oppression in other countries. To all demonstrators, I urge you to keep up this effort. It's time to move on to the second phase of this, to a more sustainable front that focuses on immigration policy over the next months and years. I want to thank you for bringing national attention to this important issue.
Yeah, instead of thanking them for their alleged activism, try condemning them for their destruction of your city. Not just the mess, but the hit they did on a local charity that has now opted to close up its food cart and try doing business somewhere else. Scott and Julie Hakes are now selling their cart at below its value just to cut their losses and move on to other ways to support their charitable mission of helping Portland's homeless population. In light of the recent news of the camp's clearing, Scott says he's still planning to sell the cart and move on, but he invites Mayor Wheeler to take a ride with him in his big food truck and discuss productive solutions to the problems the city faces. No word yet on whether the mayor has an opening in his busy schedule of virtue signaling to give time to someone making a real positive difference on the streets of his city every day. To me, this story is one of the more frustrating that I've covered lately, and I think it's because of the fact that nobody wins. Everybody involved loses. The Hakes family obviously loses, at least temporarily. Their charitable operation took a hit, and they'll have to find other revenue streams to support their mission. The protesters, they didn't win. They got kicked out of their encampment, and I bet persuaded more people against them than for them. And besides, immigration enforcement continues today as though they were never even there at all. The general public doesn't win. The taxpayer has to pay for the police presence to control this nonsense. The immediate area loses a business, a place to grab something to eat or drink with convenience, and the neighborhood loses the presence of the Hakes family. Clearly good people to have around. But who loses most of all? The people this whole fiasco was allegedly supposed to protect: the poor, the downtrodden, the vulnerable, the people living on the street who are struggling to find their next meal. That search is a degree more difficult now that Scott and Julie Hakes' charity is down on revenue this summer. Those are sandwiches or bottles of water that are now just a little scarcer. Those are stomachs that are just a little emptier while the Hakes family figures out how to re-strategize. And it's all because of this outrage mob who claims to look out for the vulnerable among us, but does nothing of the sort. The sole accomplishment of their entire 6-week stunt is harm to the vulnerable, not aid. They talked a big game, but in the end, in terms of actions, in terms of deeds, they did nothing to help anyone but themselves at the expense of everyone else. Which is why you can't be afraid to stand up to these people and call them out for the frauds that they are. Even in a far lefty city like Portland, Mayor Wheeler would have been much wiser to adopt such a strategy. No matter your politics, most people aren't willing to watch the actual destruction of their city in pursuit of them. And objectively speaking, this whole event was nothing but destructive. So call a spade and stick up for your city against those who will destroy it, even if you agree with their politics. One path leads to clean streets and successful charities to help those who get left behind. The other leads to biohazard shanty towns full of self-proclaimed virtue, but void of actual altruistic deeds to help their fellow man. Easy pick, I say. But I can't wait to see which direction Portland City leadership decides to take. Thanks as always for listening and for supporting this channel. Always appreciate that thoughtful discussion down below, and especially over on Twitter. That is at ML Christiansen. You're always welcome to coming out and chat in my live streams. Those are linked down in the description. Looking forward to it. Goodbye.